Margaret Chen had always known she was different from other nannies, but she never let that define her capabilities. At 28, she held a master's degree in child psychology from Stanford, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had spent the last 6 years working with some of the most challenging cases in pediatric behavioral therapy. Yet, as she sat in the waiting room of another high-end nanny agency in Manhattan, she could feel the familiar weight of judgment settling around her like a heavy coat. The receptionist barely looked up when Margaret approached the desk. "Are you here to drop off an application for someone?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone of assumed helplessness that Margaret had encountered countless times. "I'm here for my 3 o'clock interview," Margaret replied calmly, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. She had learned long ago that confidence was her first line of defense against prejudice. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly as she scanned her appointment book. "Oh, you're Margaret Chen? But the family specifically requested." She trailed off, clearly flustered. Margaret had heard it all before. The fumbling excuses, the sudden, position-filled announcements, the polite but firm rejections that always seemed to center around concerns about her physical limitations rather than her extensive qualifications. Standing at 3 feet 8 inches tall due to dwarfism, Margaret had faced these challenges her entire career, but she refused to let them diminish her passion for working with children. 20 minutes later, she found herself across from Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, the agency's director, whose discomfort was palpable. The woman shuffled through Margaret's impressive resume, her brow furrowed in what appeared to be genuine confusion about how to proceed. "Your credentials are remarkable," Mrs. Whitmore began, and Margaret could hear the "but" coming from a mile away. "Stanford, your thesis on developmental trauma, letters of recommendation from 3 child psychologists. It's just that the families we work with have very specific expectations." "What kind of expectations?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Well, they often need someone who can physically keep up with active children. Someone who can handle emergencies, reach high shelves, drive the children to activities." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes meeting Mrs. Whitmore's with unwavering directness. "I've been driving since I was 18 with adaptive equipment. I've handled medical emergencies, including performing CPR on a 7-year-old who nearly drowned in a pool. I've managed children with severe autism, ADHD, and oppositional defiant disorder. I've never met a high shelf I couldn't handle with proper planning, and as for keeping up with children..." She paused, allowing a small smile to cross her lips. "Children don't care about height when you can speak to them at their level, literally and figuratively." The interview continued for another 30 minutes, but Margaret could sense the predetermined outcome. Mrs. Whitmore was polite, even impressed, but the result was inevitable. 3 days later, the rejection email arrived with the usual language about finding someone who better fits the family's current needs. It was the 14th rejection in 6 months. Margaret sat in her small studio apartment in Brooklyn, staring at her laptop screen and the list of remaining agencies to contact. Her savings were dwindling, and the part-time consulting work she did for the Children's Hospital barely covered her expenses. But giving up wasn't in her vocabulary. She had fought too hard to get where she was, overcome too many obstacles, to surrender now. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend and former roommate, Sarah. "Another dead end?" "The usual," Margaret typed back. "They love my credentials until they meet me in person." "Their loss," came the immediate reply. "The right family is out there. They'll see what you're really worth." Margaret appreciated Sarah's optimism, but as she prepared for another round of applications and interviews, she couldn't help but wonder if Sarah was right. Was there really a family out there who would see past societal expectations and recognize her true value as a caregiver and educator? Meanwhile, across the city in a towering penthouse overlooking Central Park, billionaire tech entrepreneur David Harrison was facing his own childcare crisis. His 7-year-old son, Alex, had just driven away his 5th nanny in 8 months. The boy, brilliant but struggling with the recent loss of his mother in a car accident, had become increasingly difficult to manage. He refused to engage with authority figures, threw tantrums when faced with routine tasks, and seemed determined to push away anyone who tried to help him process his grief. David's assistant, Janet, knocked on his home office door with a stack of new applications. "These are from the premium agency," she announced, setting them down on his mahogany desk. "They've pre-screened everyone according to your specifications." David barely looked up from his computer screen, where he was reviewing quarterly reports that couldn't hold his attention. "Any of them have experience with grieving children?" "A few claim to, but honestly, sir, after what happened with the last nanny." Janet hesitated. The previous caregiver had quit after Alex locked himself in his room for 6 hours, refusing to come out even when David returned from his business trip. "What Alex needs isn't another stern authority figure or someone who'll try to impose structure through force," David murmured, finally looking up. "He needs someone who understands what it's like to face the world when everyone expects you to fail." Janet tilted her head, confused by the comment, but David was already lost in thought. His own childhood had been marked by struggles, not physical, but emotional and social ones that had shaped his understanding of what children really needed when the world seemed stacked against them. "Cancel all the interviews with this batch," he said suddenly. "I want you to find me someone different. Someone who's had to fight for every opportunity they've gotten. Someone who won't see Alex as a problem to be managed, but as a person to be understood." "Sir, I'm not sure I understand what you're looking for." David stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city below. "Find me someone who knows what it's like to be underestimated. Someone who's had to prove themselves over and over again. I don't care about their background or how they look on paper. I care about their heart." Janet made a note, though she still looked puzzled. "Should I contact the same agencies?" "No," David said firmly. "Cast a wider net. Look beyond the premium services. Sometimes the best people are the ones who've been overlooked by everyone else." Margaret was reorganizing her credentials for what felt like the 100th time when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the professional tone of the woman on the other end immediately caught her attention. "Ms. Chen? My name is Janet Morrison, and I work for a private client who's looking for a very special kind of nanny. Your name came up in our research, and I wondered if you might be available for an interview." Margaret's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain calm. "May I ask how you found my information?" "We've been conducting an extensive search beyond the traditional agencies. Your work with the Children's Hospital caught our attention, particularly your innovative approaches to helping children cope with trauma and loss." This was different. Most agencies led with questions about availability and basic qualifications. This woman was talking about her actual work, her specialized skills. "I'd be very interested in learning more," Margaret replied carefully. "Can you tell me about the family and what they're looking for?" "The client prefers to discuss details in person, but I can tell you it involves caring for a 7-year-old boy who's been through some difficult times. The position requires someone with genuine expertise in child psychology, not just basic childcare skills." Margaret felt a flutter of hope mixed with familiar wariness. "And your client is aware of my background?" There was a pause on the other end, and Margaret braced herself for the usual backtracking. "Ms. Chen," Janet said finally, "my employer specifically asked me to find someone who has faced significant challenges and overcome them. Someone who won't judge a child for being different or difficult. If you're referring to your dwarfism, yes, he's aware, and it's not a concern." Margaret nearly dropped the phone. In 6 months of job searching, no one had ever said those words to her. "When would you like to meet?" she managed to ask. "Tomorrow afternoon, if you're available. The interview will be at Mr. Harrison's residence." Harrison. Margaret quickly ran through her mental database of New York's prominent families but came up empty. "Could you give me a bit more context about Mr. Harrison?" "David Harrison, CEO of Harrison Technologies. I'm sure you can find more information online, but I'd prefer you form your own impression when you meet him." After ending the call, Margaret immediately pulled up her laptop and searched for David Harrison. The results were overwhelming. Articles about his revolutionary software developments, his company's IPO that had made him a billionaire by age 35, and more recently, tragic news about his wife's death in a car accident 8 months ago. But it was a smaller article, buried several pages deep in the search results, that caught her attention. It was a piece about Harrison Technologies' inclusive hiring practices and their groundbreaking accessibility initiatives. The article quoted David Harrison directly. Innovation comes from diverse perspectives. When we exclude people based on assumptions about their limitations, we limit our own potential for growth. Margaret stared at the screen, hardly daring to hope that this might finally be the opportunity she'd been waiting for. The next afternoon, Margaret stood outside a gleaming apartment building on the Upper East Side, craning her neck to take in its impressive height. The doorman, professionally courteous, directed her to a private elevator that required a key card to operate. As the elevator climbed to the penthouse, Margaret reviewed what she knew about Alex Harrison. 7 years old, recently lost his mother, struggling with behavioral issues, and had driven away 5 nannies in 8 months. It painted a picture of a child in deep pain, lashing out at a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and unsafe. The elevator doors opened directly into the Harrison penthouse, and Margaret's breath caught. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Central Park, and the space was elegantly appointed but clearly lived in. Children's books were scattered on a coffee table, and she could see art supplies spread across a dining room table. Ms. Chen, a woman in her 50s, approached with a warm smile. "I'm Janet. Mr. Harrison will be with you shortly. Can I offer you something to drink? Water would be lovely, thank you." As Janet disappeared into the kitchen, Margaret heard voices coming from down a hallway. A man's voice, patient but tired, and a child's voice, high and defiant. "I don't want to meet another nanny. They're all stupid and they smell like perfume and they try to make me eat vegetables." "Alex, we've talked about this. You don't have to like everyone, but you do have to be polite." "Why? You didn't like Nanny Caroline, and you weren't polite when you fired her." Margaret couldn't help but smile. The child had a point. Footsteps approached, and Margaret turned to see a tall man with dark hair and tired eyes walking toward her. David Harrison looked younger than his photos, but there was a weight to his expression that spoke of recent struggles. "Ms. Chen," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the chaos. We're having a bit of a negotiation about the interview process." Margaret shook his hand, noting that he bent slightly to make eye contact rather than looking down at her. It was a small gesture, but one that told her a lot about his character. "No need to apologize. I can hear that Alex has some strong opinions about nannies." David's expression softened slightly. "That's putting it diplomatically. He's been through a lot, and he's not making this easy on any of us." "Grief rarely makes anything easy," Margaret replied gently. "Especially for children who don't yet have the emotional tools to process such a profound loss." Something shifted in David's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or relief at hearing his son's behavior described in terms of pain rather than defiance. "Would you like to sit down?" he asked, gesturing to the living area. "I have to warn you, this isn't going to be a typical nanny interview." "I was hoping it wouldn't be," Margaret replied with a slight smile. "I'm not a typical nanny." As they settled into the comfortable seating area, Margaret could hear Alex's voice from his room, apparently engaged in an animated conversation with someone, or something. "He talks to his stuffed animals," David explained, following her gaze. "His therapist says it's a healthy way for him to process emotions, but he won't talk to actual people about how he's feeling." "Animals are safe," Margaret observed. "They don't judge, they don't leave, and they don't try to fix things that feel unfixable." David leaned forward slightly. "Janet told me about your background in child psychology. Can you tell me more about your experience with traumatized children?" For the next 30 minutes, Margaret found herself in the most substantive job interview of her career. David asked thoughtful questions about her therapeutic approaches, her philosophy on childhood development, and her strategies for helping children rebuild trust after loss. He didn't once ask about her physical capabilities or limitations. "There's something else you should know," David said as the interview began to wind down. He's exceptionally bright, but he uses that intelligence as a weapon sometimes. He figures out people's weaknesses and exploits them. He made his last nanny cry by telling her she was stupid and that her boyfriend was probably cheating on her." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And was he right about the boyfriend?" "Unfortunately, yes. Alex has an uncanny ability to read people." "Then he'll probably figure out pretty quickly that I'm not easily intimidated," Margaret replied. "Intelligence used as a weapon usually comes from feeling powerless. If we can help him feel safe and heard, he won't need the weapons." Just then, a small figure appeared in the doorway. A boy with dark hair like his father's and the kind of sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing. He looked Margaret up and down with the calculating gaze of someone much older than 7. "Are you the new nanny?" Alex asked bluntly. "I'm Margaret," she replied, not moving from her seat or changing her tone. "And I don't know yet if I'll be your nanny. That depends on whether we think we can work together." Alex blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Most adults, Margaret knew, immediately tried to win children over or establish their authority. She preferred a more honest approach. "You're really short," Alex observed. "You're really observant," Margaret replied calmly. The boy studied her for another moment, and Margaret could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out how to categorize her. Finally, he spoke again. "Do you know any good jokes?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I know some jokes, but I'm not sure if they're good. Humor is pretty subjective. Do you want to hear one and judge for yourself?" For the first time since Margaret had arrived, she saw a flicker of genuine curiosity in Alex's eyes. Margaret's first week at the Harrison penthouse was unlike anything she had experienced in her career. Alex was brilliant, wounded, and absolutely determined to drive her away just like he had all the others. But Margaret had faced greater challenges than one grieving 7-year-old, no matter how clever he might be. On her third day, Alex decided to test her limits. Margaret arrived to find him sitting at the breakfast table, having apparently created a modern art masterpiece using maple syrup, cereal, and what looked like an entire carton of orange juice. "Oops," he said with theatrical innocence, watching Margaret's face carefully for her reaction. Margaret surveyed the scene calmly, then walked to the kitchen island where David had left her a step stool, one of the few accommodations she'd needed. She climbed up to reach the paper towels and began cleaning without comment. "Aren't you going to yell at me?" Alex asked after several minutes of silence. "Why would I yell?" Margaret replied, continuing to wipe down the table. "Accidents happen. It wasn't an accident." "I know." Alex frowned, clearly frustrated that his provocation wasn't working. "The other nannies would have called my dad and told on me." "I'm not the other nannies." Margaret finished cleaning and disposed of the paper towels. "But I am curious about something. What were you hoping would happen when I saw this?" The question caught Alex off guard. Adults usually focused on the mess itself, not on his motivations for making it. "I wanted you to quit," he admitted quietly. "Why?" Alex shrugged, but Margaret could see the pain behind his defensive posture. "Because everyone leaves anyway. It's easier if they leave fast." Margaret felt her heart clench for this little boy who was trying so hard to protect himself from more loss. She pulled out a chair and sat down at his level. "You're right that people leave," she said gently. "Your mom left, and the other nannies left, and that hurt. But not everyone leaves for the same reasons." "My mom didn't want to leave," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, she didn't. And I bet that makes it scary to let new people get close, because what if something happens to them too?" Alex's eyes filled with tears that he quickly wiped away. "I'm not scared." "Okay," Margaret said simply. "But if you were scared, that would make sense. Losing someone you love is the scariest thing in the world." For the rest of that morning, Alex stayed close to Margaret but didn't speak much. She didn't push him to talk, instead involving him in simple activities, helping her organize his art supplies, reading a story together, working on a puzzle. By lunchtime, some of the tension had eased from his small shoulders. The real breakthrough came at the end of her first week. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing Alex's afternoon snack when she heard a crash from the living room, followed by Alex's panicked crying. She found him standing next to the coffee table, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the shattered remains of what had clearly been an expensive vase. His whole body was shaking. "I didn't mean to," he sobbed. "I was just trying to reach my book, and I knocked it over, and now Dad's going to be so mad and—" "Alex, breathe," Margaret said firmly but gently, kneeling down to his level. "Look at me. Just breathe." But Alex was spiraling into full panic mode, the kind of overwhelming fear that comes when a child who's already lost so much faces the possibility of losing more. "He's going to send me away," Alex cried. "Just like Grandma said he should. I'm too much trouble and I break everything and I make everyone leave and—" "Stop." Margaret's voice cut through his panic with quiet authority. "Alex, look at me." When his tear-filled eyes met hers, she spoke slowly and clearly. "Your father is not going to send you away. You are not too much trouble. And breaking a vase doesn't make you a bad person." "But Grandma said—" "I don't know what your grandmother said, but I know what I see. I see a little boy who's hurting and scared and trying so hard to be perfect that he can't even enjoy being 7 years old." Margaret reached out slowly, giving Alex the chance to pull away if he wanted to. When he didn't, she gently took his hands in hers. "Do you know what I used to do when I was your age and I broke something?" she asked. Alex shook his head. "I used to panic too. Because I thought breaking things proved what some people already believed, that I was careless or clumsy, or that having me around caused more problems than it was worth." Alex's sobs quieted as he focused on her words. "But do you know what I learned?" Margaret continued. "Everyone breaks things sometimes. Everyone makes mistakes. The people who love us don't stop loving us because we're not perfect." "How do you know my dad loves me?" Alex whispered. Margaret felt tears prick her own eyes at the raw vulnerability in his voice. "Because I see how he looks at you when you're not watching. I see how he keeps your mom's pictures up everywhere because he wants you to remember her. I see how he hired me not because I was the most convenient choice, but because he thought I might understand what it feels like to have the world expect you to fail." Alex was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. "Are you going to tell him about the vase?" he asked. "We're going to tell him together," Margaret replied. "And then we're going to clean it up together. And then we're going to have our snack together, because that's what people who care about each other do." When David came home that evening, Margaret and Alex were sitting at the kitchen table, sharing a plate of apple slices and peanut butter. Alex had insisted on being the one to tell his father about the vase. "Dad," he said as soon as David walked in, "I broke the blue vase in the living room. It was an accident, but I was being careless and I'm really sorry." David's expression was unreadable as he looked from his son to Margaret, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Are you hurt?" David asked, crouching down to examine Alex for cuts. "No," Margaret made sure I stayed away from the glass pieces. "Good." David pulled his son into a hug. "Things can be replaced, buddy. You can't." Margaret watched the embrace and felt something shift in her chest. This was why she did this work, not just to care for children, but to help families heal and reconnect. Later that evening, after Alex had gone to bed, David found Margaret in the living room reading. "Thank you," he said simply. "I haven't seen him that calm after making a mistake in months." "He's a remarkable child," Margaret replied. "He just needs to feel safe enough to let his guard down." David sat down across from her. "Can I ask you something? That thing you said about the world expecting you to fail, did you mean that literally?" Margaret closed her book and considered how to answer. "When you look different, People make assumptions about your capabilities. They see limitations before they see potential. I imagine Alex feels something similar, like people see his grief and his behavioral struggles and assume that's all there is to him. But it's not. Not even close. He's intelligent, creative, emotionally perceptive, and incredibly strong. He just needs someone to see those things and help him see them too. David was quiet for a moment. I was so focused on finding someone who could manage his behavior that I forgot to look for someone who could understand his heart. Understanding usually comes before managing, Margaret said with a small smile. And honestly, I don't think Alex needs to be managed. He needs to be heard. Will you stay? David asked, and Margaret could hear the hope in his voice. I know it's only been a week, but already I can see changes in him. He's starting to trust again. Margaret looked around the penthouse that had begun to feel like home, thought about the brilliant, hurting boy sleeping down the hall, and realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about backup plans or exit strategies. Yes, she said. I'll stay. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew that the real challenges were just beginning. Building trust was only the first step. Now came the harder work of helping Alex heal, and she had a feeling that journey would transform all of them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. If you're finding this story touching and want to see more inspiring content about people overcoming challenges and proving their worth, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that matter. 3 months into Margaret's tenure with the Harrison family, the changes were undeniable. Alex still had difficult days. Grief wasn't something that disappeared on a convenient timeline, but the explosive tantrums and deliberate defiance had been replaced by genuine communication and, increasingly, moments of joy. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. There had been setbacks, tears, and moments when Margaret questioned whether she was making any real difference. But slowly, patiently, she had helped Alex build new coping strategies while honoring his need to process his loss at his own pace. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Alex was struggling with his math homework. In the past, academic frustration would have triggered a meltdown, thrown books, angry tears, and declarations that he was stupid and couldn't do anything right. But this time, Margaret watched as Alex took a deep breath and used the techniques they'd been practicing. I'm feeling frustrated because this doesn't make sense, he said clearly, looking up from his worksheet. Can you help me understand it? Margaret felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with academic achievement and everything to do with emotional growth. Of course. Can you show me where you're getting stuck? As they worked through the math problem together, Alex suddenly looked up at her with serious eyes. Margaret, can I ask you something? Always. Do people ever say mean things to you? Because you're different. Margaret set down her pencil and gave Alex her full attention. Over the months, they'd had many conversations about feelings, loss, and fear, but this was the first time he'd asked about her personal experiences with being different. Sometimes they do, she answered honestly. What makes you ask? Alex fidgeted with his eraser. Yesterday at school, Tommy Martinez said his mom thinks it's weird that my nanny is a dwarf. He said his mom doesn't understand how you can take care of me properly. Margaret felt the familiar sting of judgment, but more than that, she felt protective anger on behalf of Alex, who didn't need to carry the weight of other people's ignorance. How did that make you feel when Tommy said that? She asked. Mad. And confused. Because you take better care of me than anyone except Dad and Mom used to. Alex's voice grew stronger as he spoke. You help me with my homework, you make really good sandwiches, you know when I'm sad even when I don't say anything, and you never make me feel bad for missing Mom. What did you tell Tommy? Alex straightened in his chair. I told him his mom doesn't know what she's talking about. I said you're the smartest person I know except for Dad, and that you're not different in any ways that matter. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. And how did Tommy respond to that? He said sorry and asked if you really went to Stanford. When I said yes, he said that was really cool and that his cousin wants to go there too. It was such a perfectly childlike interaction. The quick shift from cruelty to curiosity to acceptance that adults seemed to struggle with far more than children did. "You know what I think," Margaret said, reaching over to squeeze Alex's hand. "I think you're becoming an excellent advocate. That means someone who stands up for people and helps others understand when they're wrong about something. Is that what you had to do when you were growing up?" "Every single day. And sometimes I still have to do it now." Alex considered this. "Does it make you sad?" Margaret thought carefully about how to answer. "Sometimes it makes me tired," she said finally. "But it also made me strong. And it taught me that the people whose opinions really matter are the ones who take time to know who I am, not just what I look like. Like Dad did when he hired you." "Exactly like that." That evening, David came home to find Alex and Margaret in the living room, not with homework or games, but with a large poster board covered in colorful drawings and carefully written words. "What's this?" he asked, settling into his favorite chair. Alex held up the poster proudly. "It's my presentation for show and tell tomorrow. I'm going to tell my class about Margaret and explain why having dwarfism doesn't make someone less capable." David's eyebrows rose as he took in the poster's contents. Alex had drawn pictures of Margaret doing various activities, reading, cooking, driving, helping with homework, and had written facts about her education and accomplishments alongside simple explanations about dwarfism. "This is impressive, buddy. What gave you this idea?" Alex glanced at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Some kids at school don't understand about Margaret being different. They think it's weird or that she can't do her job properly. I want to help them understand." David looked at Margaret with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Is this something you're comfortable with, Margaret? Alex presenting about you to his class." "I think it's wonderful," Margaret replied. "Education is usually the best antidote to ignorance." And Alex came up with this idea entirely on his own. The presentation was a remarkable success. Alex's teacher later called David to report that not only had Alex delivered his information clearly and confidently, but that his classmates had asked thoughtful questions and several had expressed interest in learning more about different types of people and abilities. But the real measure of their progress came 2 weeks later, during what Margaret would later think of as the ice cream incident. She and Alex were walking back from the park on a warm Saturday afternoon when Alex spotted an ice cream truck. As they stood in line, Margaret heard a woman behind them speaking in a loud stage whisper to her companion. "I just don't understand why people like that choose to work with children. Seems selfish, if you ask me. How is she supposed to keep up with an active boy?" Margaret tensed, preparing herself for the familiar cocktail of anger and humiliation. But before she could respond, Alex turned around to face the woman. "Excuse me," he said with the kind of polite formality that only 7-year-olds can master. "I think you're talking about my nanny, Margaret." The woman looked flustered. "Oh, I didn't realize. I mean, she has dwarfism," Alex continued matter-of-factly. "That means she's shorter than most adults, but it doesn't affect her intelligence or her ability to take care of me. She has a master's degree from Stanford University and she's really good at helping kids who are sad or scared." Margaret watched in amazement as Alex, with complete composure, proceeded to educate this stranger about dwarfism, his own experiences with loss, and Margaret's qualifications as a caregiver. "She runs faster than me when we play tag," Alex concluded. "And she reaches things on high shelves by using tools, just like my dad uses a ladder to change light bulbs even though he's tall. Different problems, same solutions." The woman's face had gone through several shades of red during Alex's impromptu lecture. I apologize," she mumbled. "I didn't mean to be rude." "That's okay," Alex replied graciously. "Most people just don't know much about dwarfism. Margaret taught me that people aren't usually mean on purpose, they're just uninformed." As they walked home with their ice cream, Alex slipped his free hand into Margaret's. "Did I do okay back there?" he asked. Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "You did more than okay. You were brave, kind, and incredibly articulate. Your mom would be so proud of how you stood up for someone you care about." Alex beamed at the mention of his mother, something that would have sent him into tears just months earlier. "Margaret," he said after a few moments of comfortable silence. "Yes. When I grow up, I want to be the kind of person who hires people like Dad did with you. You know, someone who cares more about what's in here," he tapped his chest, "than what people look like on the outside." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I think you're already that kind of person, Alex. You just needed to find your voice." That night, after Alex had gone to bed, Margaret found herself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this family. She had come here looking for a job, but had found something much more valuable: the opportunity to help a child heal while proving to herself and others that worth wasn't measured in inches or conventional expectations. More importantly, she had learned that sometimes the people who need us most are the ones who give us the greatest gifts in return. Alex had needed someone to see past his pain to his potential, and in doing so, he had learned to see past surfaces to the heart of what really mattered. The story was far from over, but Margaret knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they had built something strong enough to weather them together. 1 year after Margaret Chen first walked into the Harrison penthouse, the family had transformed in ways that none of them could have predicted. What had begun as a desperate search for childcare had evolved into something much more profound, a testament to the power of looking beyond surface assumptions to find extraordinary potential. Alex, now 8, had grown into a confident, empathetic boy who wore his sensitivity as a strength rather than a weakness. The anniversary of his mother's death had passed 2 months earlier, and while it had been a difficult time for everyone, Alex had faced his grief with tools that Margaret had helped him develop. He spoke about his mother freely now, sharing memories and acknowledging his sadness without being consumed by it. The morning of Margaret's 1-year anniversary with the family, Alex bounded into the kitchen with an excitement that had become his new normal. "Margaret, Dad, you have to see what I made." David looked up from his coffee with the kind of relaxed smile that had replaced his constant worry. "What's the masterpiece today, buddy?" Alex proudly displayed a handmade book, carefully constructed with construction paper, drawings, and his increasingly neat handwriting. The cover read, "The Story of My Nanny Margaret, How She Saved Our Family." "Alex," Margaret said, touched by the gesture, "this is beautiful. Can you read it to us?" As Alex began reading his story aloud, Margaret realized he had captured not just the events of the past year, but the emotional journey they had all taken together. "Once upon a time," Alex read, "there was a little boy who was very sad because his mommy died. He was mean to everyone because he thought if he was mean first, it wouldn't hurt so much when they left. Then his daddy hired a nanny named Margaret who was different from other people, but different in good ways." Alex turned the page, revealing a drawing of himself and Margaret working on a puzzle together. "Margaret didn't try to make me stop being sad about mommy. Instead, she taught me that being sad was okay, and that I could be sad and happy at the same time. She showed me that being different doesn't make you less good at things. Sometimes it makes you better because you understand other people who feel different too." David reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand as Alex continued his story, detailing their adventures, their difficult moments, and the gradual building of trust between them. "The best part about Margaret," Alex read from his final page, "is that she never gave up on me, even when I was being really hard to love. She taught me that families aren't just people who look the same or came from the same place. Families are people who choose to love each other and stick together even when things are difficult." When Alex finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye at the breakfast table. Margaret pulled him into a hug, overwhelmed by the depth of his emotional growth and his ability to articulate such profound concepts. "Alex, this is the most wonderful gift anyone has ever given me," she said softly. Later that morning, as Margaret was helping Alex get ready for school, he brought up a topic that had been on his mind for weeks. "Margaret, I've been thinking about something. You know how you always tell me that when people are mean or don't understand something, the best thing to do is educate them." "That's right. Education and patience usually work better than anger." "Well, I think more people need to learn about different kinds of people. Not just about dwarfism, but about all the ways people can be different and still be amazing. Margaret paused in packing his backpack. What did you have in mind? What if we started a club at school? Like, a club where kids learn about different abilities and differences, and maybe sometimes special guests come talk to us. The idea was so thoughtful and mature that Margaret had to take a moment to process it. That's a remarkable idea, Alex. Have you talked to your teacher about it? Not yet. I wanted to ask you first if you'd help me, and maybe you could be one of the guest speakers. Margaret felt her heart swell with pride. A year ago, Alex had been ashamed of having a nanny who looked different. Now he wanted to celebrate that difference and help other children understand and accept diversity. I would be honored to help you with that club, she said. And yes, I'd be happy to speak to your classmates any time you think it would be helpful. That afternoon, Margaret found herself in the unusual position of sitting in David's home office discussing not childcare logistics, but a business proposition. I've been thinking, David said, leaning back in his chair, about what you and Alex have built this year, and about the impact you've had not just on him, but on everyone who's met you. Margaret waited, curious about where this conversation was heading. Harrison Technologies has been looking for ways to expand our community outreach programs. What would you think about developing an educational initiative focused on diversity, inclusion, and different abilities? Something that could be implemented in schools, community centers, maybe even corporate settings. Margaret's eyes widened. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity to take what you've learned and taught Alex and share it with a much wider audience. You'd still be Alex's nanny, he made it very clear that's non-negotiable, but you'd also have resources to develop educational programs that could help thousands of children and adults understand and celebrate differences instead of fearing them. The offer was more than Margaret had ever dared to dream. It would combine her passion for child psychology with her desire to advocate for people with differences, while allowing her to maintain her relationship with Alex and David. What made you think of this? She asked. David smiled. Alex, actually. He told me about his idea for the school club, and it got me thinking about the ripple effect of education. You changed his perspective, he's changing his classmates' perspectives, they'll go home and potentially change their families' perspectives. Why not scale that impact? 3 months later, Margaret stood in front of a packed auditorium at Alex's school, preparing to deliver the inaugural presentation of the Different and Amazing educational series. Alex sat in the front row, beaming with pride as he introduced her to the crowd. This is my nanny, Margaret Chen, he announced confidently. She has dwarfism, which means she's shorter than most adults, but she's one of the smartest and kindest people you'll ever meet. She helped me learn that being different isn't something to be ashamed of, it's something to be proud of. As Margaret began her presentation, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. A year and a half ago, she had been facing rejection after rejection, told repeatedly that she wasn't suitable for working with children because of her physical differences. Now, she was not only successfully caring for a child who had been considered difficult and unmanageable, but she was helping to educate entire communities about the value of diversity and inclusion. When I first met Alex, Margaret told the audience, he was angry and scared and convinced that anyone who tried to get close to him would eventually leave. I was discouraged and tired and starting to believe that maybe I really wasn't cut out for this work. She paused, making eye contact with Alex, who gave her an encouraging thumbs up. But we both learned something important over the past year. We learned that the things that make us different, whether it's grieving the loss of a parent, or having dwarfism, or being afraid to trust new people, those differences don't make us less valuable. They make us uniquely qualified to understand and help other people who are struggling with their own challenges. The presentation was a resounding success. Children asked thoughtful questions, teachers requested follow-up materials, and parents approached Margaret afterward to thank her for helping their children understand that differences should be celebrated rather than feared. But the moment that meant the most to Margaret came at the end of the evening, when a shy girl with leg braces slowly made her way to the front of the auditorium. Miss Margaret, the girl said quietly, I just wanted to say thank you. Nobody ever told me before that being different could be a good thing. Margaret knelt down to the girl's eye level. What's your name, sweetheart? Emma. I'm in 3rd grade. Well, Emma, I want you to remember something very important. You're not different in any way that matters to the people who truly care about you. And the things that make you unique, your perspective, your strength, your experiences, those are gifts that only you can give to the world. As Emma walked away with a smile brighter than Margaret had ever seen, Alex appeared at her side. That was awesome, Margaret. I think you just changed that girl's whole life. I think we both did, Margaret replied, putting her arm around Alex. This was your idea, remember? 6 months later, the Different and Amazing program had been implemented in 12 schools across New York City, with requests coming in from districts around the country. Margaret had hired 2 additional educators and was working on developing online resources that could reach even more children and families. But perhaps more importantly, Alex had started his diversity club at school, which had grown from 5 interested students to over 30. He had become a natural leader, helping his peers understand not just physical differences, but emotional and cultural differences as well. One evening, as Margaret was helping Alex with his homework, he looked up from his math worksheet with a serious expression. Margaret, can I ask you something kind of big? Always. Do you think my mom would be proud of who I've become? Margaret set down her pencil and gave Alex her full attention. It was a question he'd been working up to for months, and she knew how important her answer would be. Alex, I think your mom would be amazed by the person you've become. You've taken all the love she gave you and used it to help other people feel less alone. You've turned your own pain into compassion for others. You've become exactly the kind of person who makes the world a better place. Alex nodded thoughtfully. I think she'd like you too. She always wanted me to be kind to people who were different or struggling. Then I think we're honoring her memory perfectly, Margaret said softly. As Alex returned to his homework, Margaret reflected on the unexpected family they had created. They didn't look like a traditional family, and their journey together hadn't followed any conventional path. But they had built something beautiful and strong out of mutual respect, understanding, and love. More importantly, they had proven that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. A billionaire desperate for help, a grieving child who had given up on adults, and a woman who had been told she wasn't suitable for the job had somehow found each other and created something extraordinary. David appeared in the doorway, home from another successful day at work. The stress lines that had marked his face when Margaret first met him were gone, replaced by the relaxed expression of a father who no longer worried constantly about his son's well-being. How was the presentation at the community center today? He asked. Amazing. We had over 200 people, and I think we changed some minds about what it means to have different abilities. Dad, guess what? Alex interrupted excitedly. Margaret got asked to speak at a conference in Chicago next month, and they want to invite kids from all over to share their stories about being different and proud of it. David smiled at his son's enthusiasm. That's incredible. It sounds like our little family project is becoming something much bigger. It was never little, Margaret corrected gently. Teaching one child to see value in themselves and others, that's the biggest thing you can do. Everything else is just expanding that first circle of understanding. That night, after Alex had gone to bed, Margaret stood in her room looking out at the city lights. In 18 months, her entire life had changed. She had gone from facing constant rejection to becoming a sought-after speaker and educator. She had helped a grieving child heal and grow into a confident advocate for others. But most importantly, she had proven to herself and the world that worth wasn't measured by conventional standards or physical appearance. It was measured by the depth of care you brought to your relationships, the knowledge and skills you developed, and the positive impact you had on the lives of others. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, her best friend who had supported her through all those rejections. Just saw the article about your program in the Times. I told you the right family would see your worth. I just never imagined you'd end up changing the world. Margaret smiled as she typed back, I didn't change the world. I just helped one little boy see himself differently, and he's the one changing everything else." As she settled into bed, Margaret thought about all the children who would benefit from the programs she was developing, all the families who would learn to celebrate rather than fear differences, and all the people like herself who would find doors opening that had previously been closed. The story that had begun with repeated rejections and a desperate father's unconventional hiring decision had become something none of them could have imagined, a legacy of understanding, acceptance, and love that would impact generations to come. And it all started with one simple truth that took a year to fully understand. Sometimes the person who seems least likely to fit is exactly the person you need most. If this story has touched your heart and inspired you to think differently about the people around you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this one because we believe that understanding and celebrating our differences makes all of us stronger. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you content that matters, stories that change perspectives, and narratives that remind us of the extraordinary potential in every person we meet. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not just what they appear to be on the surface.